Conversion therapy doesn't work. Setting aside the very real question of why someone should or would want to fix their orientation or gender identity, major medical bodies like the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association have long since concluded that conversion therapy does not work and is associated with increased depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Yet, until shockingly recently, it's been considered a perfectly valid medical practice. At the same time, well-evidenced forms of gender-affirming care are being interfered with or downright banned across the nation and the world against the wishes of medical providers. In a post-COVID lockdown society with medical misinformation and culture war content being beamed directly to our fingertips, it's probably a good time to discuss personal freedom and ideology presented as healthcare. What does freedom of choice, bodily autonomy, and good science actually look like in 2026? Well, let's get into it, because Talk Heathen is coming right now.
Welcome, everybody. Today is February 22nd now. I'm your host, Dr. Ben, and joining me today is Christy Powell. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing all right. I'm excited to get mixed up in some kind of messy content here.
Absolutely. We had some great talks before the show, and I'm excited to see what kind of callers we get and where we're going. And with that, this is Talk Heathen. We have a couple, I guess, more than a couple. We got 3 different streams going. We have a vertical stream on YouTube and on TikTok now. And we also have our traditional horizontal stream also on YouTube. So whichever chat you are sitting in, be sure to comment, tell us live what you think of the show, what calls you like and don't like, all that jazz. Also be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share the video out to more people.
And hello to the future and all of our friends listening in various podcast forms.
Yes. We air live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Central Time on YouTube and on TikTok, but you can also watch on Patreon, just like Christy mentioned. And this is a live call-in show, and we have open lines available to talk with you. So get your calls in at 512-991-9242 or from your computer at tiny.cc/call-th. And we are looking for really any calls about religion, what you think of the universe, if you think the supernatural is real, or especially today, you have a doctor and a therapist here to answer your questions on, is conversion therapy okay? Are trans people mentally ill? If you think sex addiction is a real thing, then definitely call in, because we really, really want to have a conversation. And we have lines open for you. And just a reminder that Talk Heathen is a production of the Atheist Community of Austin, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of atheism, critical thinking, secular humanism, and the separation of religion and government. And Christy and I aren't the only people here today. We also have some very, very beautiful people in the crew. So let's go to the crew cam. Thank you to everybody there. We have audio and video people, moderators, notes and stamps people, and the call screeners who are all working very hard to make this show go on. And if you want to see yourself on this lovely crew cam, you can possibly become one, or you could even become a guest on the shows and maybe a host. We're looking for people interested in furthering the organization. And if you are interested in this opportunity, you can send an email to volunteer@atheist-community.org to get involved. And with that, any other announcements that you'd like to add, Christy, before we get into our first caller?
You know, plenty of good stuff to talk about and plenty of things I'm sure we'll touch base on. But I know that Michelle from New York has been waiting on the line for a good bit here as we were sitting in the green room. So if it's okay with you, let's jump right into it.
Let's do it. All right. Let's talk with Michelle. Pronouns are she, her, from New York. Michelle, you are live on Talk Heathen. It sounds like you want to talk about infinity. Can you describe your perspective to us?
Yes, I can. But first of all, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Elise, my call screener, fantastic. They did a fantastic job in screening my call. And also, I'd like to give a big shout out to my good friend and wonderful lady, Katie Montgomery, and also Kelly Laughlin and Objectively Dan.
Yeah, we've got some great people as part of the organization. I really enjoy and admire just about everybody that you mentioned there, and the people I don't enjoy and admire, I haven't spent nearly enough time with. So glad to have you on the line, Michelle. What did you want to get into?
Am I right to understand this is the 10th anniversary of the show?
This is our 10th year, yes.
Your 10th year. This is an auspicious time, a very auspicious time for me to call in, because I'd like to discuss infinity, and I've been trying to quantify it in many different ways for several years now. And so recently I've come up with a big breakthrough, and I've kind of drawn it all together in all my works and kind of put them in. And one thing I put together here is I'm working on most recently putting together describing infinity in English and like a vernacular, in a verbiage. Like just
I can appreciate that.
Okay.
It is obviously an infinitely difficult concept to really wrap our tiny monkey brains around. I'm curious, before we get into the particulars, what this information does to inform you about life, the universe, and everything. Whether we crunch infinity into a specific data set, or we look at it through these like cardinal lenses, or however else we want to understand infinity, what does it tell us about the nature of the universe or creation or some of these broader concepts for the Talk Heathen audience?
Yes, that's such a great question, Christy. I'm so glad you asked that question. What a fantastic question to ask, and what a great way to guide me and to mold me into what I need to become to answer, to guide this conversation.
All right, this is getting a little out of hand.
But Christy, you're an atheist. Why did you say creation?
Yeah, I mean, so you and I are talking audio, and you may not have seen the kind of rough air quotes that I've put into all of this. But when I talk about the notion of creation, it's because we are here to discuss what we believe and why. And a lot of that is going to acknowledge not just my own religious roots, but the religious roots of people in our audience, or people who are still connected to a faith tradition. So when we talk about existence, the question of a creator God or not is very much germane to all of this, even if I certainly don't endorse that idea.
Right. But anyway, what's important about this conversation is I think that if we could quantify infinity as I've begun to quantify it, if we could actually prove that infinity is a quantifiable number, at the very least, I think it would tell us, I think we could derive from that the answer of if we could actually come up with an infinite supply of energy.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that gets us any closer or further away from God, but I'm willing to go down this road with you. Just help me understand what we're talking about. We're a few minutes into the call, and I'm not quite clear on what you're here to present.
Oh, I was more presenting, well, I mean, if you want God, I did go down the route of like, maybe if infinity is quantifiable, and if you could prove that there is a number beyond which just any number goes beyond, and if God is said to be out like beyond infinity, that would kind of imply that at least the possibility of God is open to be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I definitely see the desire to explore this thing, and I think what Christy and I were wanting to know, as far as the utility aspect, is like, do you envision this being more of an exploratory type thing of like, what if we could know, like if we could think of a way to study this, how would we do it, in more of a philosophical type sense? Or is this something that we're going to use in our everyday lives, or use in some kind of research capacity to make some other type of discovery that will help humanity. So I want to know kind of which vein of this we really want to go down, because I mean they're both good conversations, but I think framing it in one of those two ways maybe will help us understand the intention behind asking this question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ben. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for helping me understand where we should take this even better. But I'd like to take it down the route of what kind of technologies and kind of things that, and what could better society by having a quantifying infinity, if we could quantify it at all. Like for example, do you remember if everyone says, gee, wouldn't it be cool if we could come up with replicators like they have on Star Trek, you know? Well, like on Star Trek Voyager, when they got stuck out in the Delta 9 quadrant or whatever, wherever they were, do you remember they had to ration their replicators? They had they talked about replication or replicator rations. So not even that they had cracked infinite energy yet, because if they had infinite energy, they wouldn't have need to have replicator rations. They could just do whatever, and they could just put the energy in and then get the whatever they needed out.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. I think it's great that we've got the things that we want to accomplish. My next question is, what do you propose we do to test for this? Like, how do you propose that we start quantifying infinity if that's the end goal? Because it sounds like we know where we want to end up, but how do we get there?
I say we do where I mean, I had it at tic-tac-toe. When I had it at tic-tac-toe, I realized that I was really on quantifying infinity. I'm not going to, maybe some mathematicians who are listening in will pick up on where I went with tic-tac-toe and where I got with that. But
yeah, can you explain? Because a lot of us, I mean, I'm not a mathematician or a physicist or anything. Can you walk Christy and myself through it as if we don't understand what you're talking about? Because I think that'll help us and the callers understand, the audience understand where you're going with it.
Come on, Dr. Ben. You're just playing Dumay with me, Dr. Ben. You know what I'm
no, not at all. And we're also have an audience that might not know what you're talking about. So I think it'd be helpful. Otherwise, we might talk past each other if we just assume we know what we're saying. So if you can explain it to us like we're five.
Yes. Well, when I gave the tic-tac-toe analogy, I was merely kind of being coy. I have to be a little coy with that one because that would give up too much of my theorem away and my hypothesis if I explain that in its full detail. But to go back to the other piece,
I'm confused though. Why would you be worried about giving away your hypothesis or your theorem?
What are we here to talk about if not that?
Yeah, and like if we're genuinely interested in furthering humanity, like the whole scientific method hinges on being able to replicate and test our experiments, right? So the goal isn't to hide things for yourself, it's to make the information public so that other people can verify that the experiment you did is an accurate representation of what happens in reality. So that's a little bit concerning to me that you would want to not give away your hypothesis.
May I apologize? You're right. Anyway,
yeah. So
I started drawing. I was like, when I was trying to wrap my mind around infinity, I was like, all of a sudden, I just started to draw. You know, like when you draw tic-tac-toe out the tic-tac-toe box to get ready to play tic-tac-toe. Like everyone,
yep.
Can we assume that everyone knows how that's done, tic-tac-toe?
Yep.
So first of all, I drew a tic-tac-toe square, and then I drew another one box. And then in the first one, I drew all X's in each box, in each little square. And then in the second one, I drew all O's. I was like, my God, that's infinity. That represents infinity. That's at least one. I've got two diagrams that represent infinity, and together they both accurately represent more of the nature of infinity when juxtaposed next to each other.
In what manner? Give us just the elevator pitch on how that represents infinity.
Well, infinity, really, if you think about it, to actually be a quantifiable number or a quantifiable number of anything, it would have to be quantifiable in any number of in any different number and variable given way in various given ways, right?
I'm not sure I'm confident in your knowledge of probabilities. And I think my suggestion would be maybe going and doing a little bit of homework before you call in again, maybe narrow all this down to a very succinct and concise elevator pitch. And that might be easier to discuss in the future. But I think I'm a little confused how all these factors connect together. So I would recommend going and thinking about that, and we're going to move on with our discussion. So have a great day, Michelle. We'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll say, Ben, infinity is one of those concepts that keeps me up at night, probably in some ways because I don't understand it at all. I'm certainly not a mathematician, but no matter how much I read about the subject or how many, late night documentaries I try to squeeze in, it definitely tickles a part of my brain, but it never quite wraps itself around anything. And I think it can really draw people in as a fascinating concept without necessarily giving people anything to actually hold on to.
Right. It's something I like to call like mental masturbation in a way, where it's like it feels really nice sometimes to just have a discussion about philosophy or of the universe that doesn't really matter for much. It's not going to change how we go about our daily lives. It's not going to change most people's worldview. But it can be nice to exercise your brain a little bit and think through that. So I admire, people that find that fun as a hobby. I'm not super interested in that myself. And I don't know how much I have to add to that particular conversation without some more succinct points. So
yeah. No, fair to say. Happy to move on.
All right. So we do have open lines here. And again, we would love for people to call in. I know we mentioned talk about LGBTQ people previously. There's especially a lot of rhetoric right now of is gender dysphoria a mental illness? So if people want to say yes, it is. I know we got some people in the poll in the side chat saying yes. And if you said yes, you should be calling in because maybe you can convince us that that's the case. I am a trans person. If you want to talk to a trans person and tell me why I'm mentally ill, I'm here to take that call. But if we have a therapist here who knows a lot about sexuality. So if you want to talk about does conversion therapy work? If you want to talk about sex addiction, something else is, do you think masturbation is a sin? Do you think that porn ruins marriages? I'd love to take your calls on all that as well. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, would you like to bring up Flabbergasted to have a little discussion with us?
Yeah. Let's kind of jump into it.
All right. Welcome up, Flabbergasted. Do you want to say hi to the audience?
Hey, everyone. How you doing? I'm Flabbergasted, and I'm super happy to be here. Mm-hmm. I'm also Flabbergasted.
Flabbergasted's helping us out as the backup today. And we're prepared to have a pretty fun discussion about medical malpractice and like mental health malpractice and all that stuff. So, Christy, I know you laid out some questions for us.
Yeah, I brought it up just in the introduction, but I think I want to kind of check in about the year of our Lord 2026. Like what does good science in public discourse actually look like right now? Ben, you have been studying to be a doctor and doing this type of work out on the internet since before the COVID lockdowns. And I'm curious just what you have witnessed as your education and your experience with having these conversations has gone up, but also as our culture has like really shifted in the type of information, the type of misinformation that we're taking in. I'm interested, maybe not in a broad historical perspective, but just on how shit has gone totally different in the past 5, maybe 10-ish years.
Yeah, and there's always been kind of this like undercurrent of I don't want people to confuse the term skepticism with like just not believing in science, because those are different things. A lot of people will say that they're skeptics, but really they are just uninformed on the issues and
Sure.
And not accepting of scientific consensus. And something that I noticed with a lot of rhetoric that was, I actually found a post recently that put into words exactly what I think a lot of the issues are with just the general discourse about science and medicine and consensus. So this post is from a physician who says, "Here's the uncomfortable truth. Debate only works when both sides share the same rules. If someone is not trained in epidemiology, statistics, trial design, pharmacology, or immunology, etc., yet insists that they can tear apart a paper, what they're usually tearing apart is their own misunderstanding of the paper. And that reading a paper is not the same as understanding a paper." And so they kind of go on to say that to interpret clinical research, there's some things that you need to know ahead of time. You need to know what constitutes appropriate controls. You need to know what statistical power means. You need to know absolute versus relative risk, confounding versus causation. You need to understand bias, multiplicity, and subgroup fragility. You need to know background incidence rates, plausibility versus demonstrated effect. And then if you don't know a lot of those things, what ends up happening is you start cherry picking sentences from the papers. You start confusing the hypothesis with the conclusion. You start elevating limitations into refutations, which that is one I actually came across very recently. I was doing a debunk on raw milk, and there's an organization specifically to promote the drinking of raw dairy products. And they said, well, this study has limitations, so we can just throw that out. But then their argument to platform their own position was anecdotes. It's like, so your standard of evidence was very, very high for this paper, but it was very, very low for your own position.
Sure.
So saying that a limitation means that the study has to be thrown out. And then also, of course, they mistake correlations for proof, and then they declare victory because they tore down a straw man of what the study was actually proposing. So I know that was a lot of things that I said there, but it all boils down to, if you don't have adequate understanding of what you're arguing against, you're not really going to make an effective argument.
Making information in many ways more available, having these AIs that can help us to like boil things down, being able to access stuff on Wikipedia rather than having to go into like a university medical science library and check things out with a card catalog. All of this has put a ton of information in front of people that they're welcome to and invited to play around with, but should not confuse themselves as properly equipped to like consume, and certainly not to tear apart. Is all that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And along with that, you made a very good point in the notes here, is consensus. There's a lot of discussion lately about what is the consensus and why is it the consensus, and people confused about what standard allows you to override the consensus. Like some people will say, well, I have this expert that disagrees with the consensus, therefore they should be, it's like they should be equally platformed. And that's not true. One expert does not outweigh a consensus. You have mountains and mountains of data that goes into a consensus. You have multitudes of experts and expert boards that weigh in on this decision. And there's a pretty high bar for that consensus to be overturned. And so people shouldn't be confused and think that just because somebody disagrees, that means that they should be able to go toe to toe and put one person from the medical consensus view on one side and the disagreeer on the other side and have that be a fair debate. When
we live with this notion that fair and balanced means you have one talking head saying white and another talking head saying black, and so the audience tends to hear and understand gray, when in reality you may have a multitude of scientists who are all vehemently saying white and like only one crackpot saying black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think part of this too is this, and this is a complaint that I think I've received on this show, and maybe you have as well, this idea that, I don't want to call in because I want it to be a formal debate where there's a moderator and we each get platformed equally. And my big concern with that is, especially when we're talking about humanism, and especially with regard to LGBTQ rights and mental health issues, this is something we don't want to platform all sides equally. Like being able to say that, it's like saying that that trans people aren't people, or that people with mental illness shouldn't be treated with dignity. Those are things that should not be weighed equally to they should be treated equally. So
so then how should we differentiate between medical disagreement, maybe like infighting, or just a lack of broad consensus, and straight up medical misinformation? Is it all just about the number of scientists on one or the other side of the aisle and these minority positions? Is it about quality of evidence, replication? Like how do we, particularly as laymen, read a news headline and know what the fuck it actually means?
It goes down to the evidence and the standard of evidence. And so, yes, there is a process of peer review, which a lot of people may say, well, but if you have your peers, like people in that same field, reviewing the data, then isn't that just can't people just come together and agree on whatever they want? And no, that's not how this works. They have to meet very strict standards for overturning the previous consensus, and so this involves a lot of studies, a lot of statistical work, there's a lot more that goes into that than just coming to an agreement. And Christy, I want to hear some of your thoughts on this as well, because I mean I've talked a lot about kind of my experience in the field, but it seems like there's a ton of medical misinformation just about the like raw objective science of that. But I know as we get into psychology, there's a lot more gray as far as, is this subjective or objective, and how do we come up with our standards of practice? Do you think that this discussion is a bit different for the field of psychology, or how do you feel about this?
I mean, I would say that there's a difference between what we see in a research laboratory and what we see in a clinical office. As a clinician myself, I, of course, am only going to use evidence-based practices. I'm only going to work from certain positions or theories that I know have been well tested in a laboratory setting. But when you are actually the, mechanic underneath the car, while you are checking the manual and you are looking at the diagrams of how it's supposed to be, you're working with your hands. Like, you're getting dirty and seeing things from a very first person point of view. And in that kind of context, in that sort of setting, it's very much a go with what works. We have a understanding of what we know statistically tends to work well, and even more importantly, what we know tends not to work well, to very much guide and rein in our expectations. But then we're also working with our clients to understand how they feel, what they want, what they're drawn towards. You know, I used to have a friend who was a physical trainer, and whenever we would try to talk to him about what's the best form of exercise, you know, is it pure cardio? Is it mixing things up? Like, should you do weights on Tuesdays and cardio on Wednesdays? What are the best strategies? And he would always just kind of look at us and say, the best exercise for you is the exercise that you'll actually do. So when we start to look at these things from a like one-on-one individual perspective, there is a certain amount of, well, if this is the type of therapy that is working for you, that is interesting to you, that makes sense to you, then we're going to follow the hot hand and go with what works, all while trying to keep in mind these like larger statistical models. Where I think misinformation comes into it is people follow that same sort of philosophy of this feels good, this feels right, this feels natural, I'm drawn towards it. And they kind of ignore the very dangerous self-fulfilling prophecies that can come connected to all of that, which is just to say, as I'm maybe sounding like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, that it's nuanced and there's a need for wisdom and for training rather than just kind of winging it and seeing what feels good or what one particular book says. So
yeah,
same way. I know I'm trying to summarize a lot here, so I hope that touches on the question you're really asking.
Yeah, and flabbergasted. I just want to let you in here. I know you've been sitting there quietly while we babble.
You guys are talking about science, and I'm not a scientist. I'm a former history teacher, right? Like, but I kind of wanted to jump in a little bit on that from the social science perspective because it's still relevant here. And I think one thing that is true in both social sciences and the hard sciences is this idea that people come at these conversations from what is effectively, I want to say, elementary level understanding, but we're talking high school, middle school level understanding of these topics. And then thinking that understanding is sufficient to challenge the advanced understandings. Oh, well, this is basic math. This is basic science. This is basic history. And the problem with this is whenever we're talking about something that's basic, it's because it's been simplified to the point that someone who doesn't understand all the nuance can understand it enough to get the big picture. And the process of doing that is inherently making it not as accurate as it really is. And so these are the people that are coming into these conversations and being like, oh, well, gender's not a social construct, or trans people aren't real. It's basic science. There's two sexes. It's male and female, and it's binary. And it's like, just because that's what your middle school textbook says doesn't mean that there's not a larger understanding of it. You're looking at this hyper simplified understanding of reality.
Most basic of
the
science.
Most basic.
Yeah, basic aspect of science.
Yeah, we had to like simplify this down so a 12-year-old understands it. Why do you think that's the most accurate understanding of this like extremely big picture topic? And that drives me absolutely insane because the same thing happens in history. But the other thing I wanted to hit on as well, and sorry for my rambling now.
No.
Is on the topic of Christy, you asked a question about how do we like tell if the information we're getting is good. And I think if you are a scientist, if you are a doctor, if you are a historian or trained in history, it's easier to do that. But as the peons of these topics, when we talk about science, that's me. I am a scientific peon. I know nothing. Well, probably more than average, but not enough to really truly know these in a really advanced way. I think people need to learn to start like vetting their sources and really understanding it. And that's, I think, what it comes down to. You asked, when we see this headline, how do we know if we should trust it? Well, you should look at who wrote it and why they wrote it.
And read past the headline, right? Like, and read past the headline. Into the article.
Yeah, exactly. Read past the headline, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what qualifications do they have to write about this? Because we see geologists talk about biology and they're like, well, I'm a scientist, so you should trust me on this. And it's like, well, but you know about rocks, not about DNA. So why are we listening to you on the topic of evolution, right? You have like, if I was to suddenly start talking about ancient Egypt, I specialize in Japanese history. If I start talking about ancient Egyptian history, I'm not coming at that with much credibility. Much more credibility if I'm in my particular field of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't know, if I'm just saying I'm a historian, you should trust me, I know everything about history, maybe that should put us red flags for people. And I don't think people are so ready to throw up red flags because they like what they hear and they want to go with that instead of actually think critically. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I have a couple things
Rant
to
over.
jump in with those specifically. Just on that point of scope, like, so of course, I'm a physician, and like right now, my knowledge is fairly general. I'm working towards specializing in kidneys, but either way, like my knowledge is within the field of like clinical medicine, and I can maybe dip into academic medicine. My undergrad degree is in biology, so I can weigh in on that. I can weigh in a little bit on chemistry, but I've had somebody recently approach me about like social sciences, specifically like social psychology, and I had to say, I am not the person to ask this question to, especially because it was about some research topic that they wanted to do. I'm like, I've never done social science research. I am not the person to weigh in on this. And just because I understand research in like medicine does not mean that those skills transfer over. And I honestly cannot give any helpful advice on this. And so it's important that, and even though it makes me look like I don't know anything, like that's fine. I don't want to give somebody the wrong information. And I don't want to diminish somebody else's field. Like it would be disingenuous, but also insulting for me to think that I can weigh in as an expert on that when I took gen psych in undergrad, like 10 years ago. Like that's the extent of my psych understanding. So like maybe I could share my thoughts on something very, very basic, but I can't go much beyond that. And something else with the headlines, recently, I don't know if either of you are familiar with Penisgate and that whole situation.
Oh, you're talking
No,
about
but I
the
wanna
Olympic
be.
cheating allegations?
Yes.
I'm only vaguely familiar if you want to walk the audience through it quickly.
Yeah, and so this directly relates to the headline. So there are some allegations that Olympic ski jumpers, were injecting themselves in the penis to make their junk bigger so that they could get more fabric on their suits and then be able to fly farther. Well, many of the headlines were saying that ski jumpers are injecting acid into their penises for this purpose. But that is intentionally misleading because, yes, it's technically true that they were using acid, but it was hyaluronic acid, which is the same thing as lip filler. So it is something that is safe to inject into the tissue, and it's often used cosmetically or even can be used medically for like there's some data suggesting it could help with premature ejaculation. So it is a verified procedure. And, if you are an adult and can consent to your own medical care and you want a procedure like that, then I can't really say don't do it. But it's dishonest for a headline to say that they're injecting acid to make you think that it's some corrosive material when it was literally it was filler. And those are two very, very different things that were said. So it is very important to, if you don't know really the extent of the story, like look into other retellings of the story, see if there are details you missed. And if you're unclear with what's being said, then maybe investigate further, because maybe it's a less interesting headline than you thought from the beginning.
Sure. Well, yeah, and you touched on some pretty important questions, I think, about personal autonomy and consent, like somebody's right to have, I'm oversimplifying, I know, but to have lip filler injected into their penis. Is that something we as a society, is that something the medical profession ought to allow? And what are the implications for that for somebody having access to HRT or to ivermectin when we know that it's not actually going to help with their COVID infection? Like, how are we drawing those lines? How do you feel like we should be drawing those lines? And what can you tell us about that autonomy consent piece of medical care in 2026?
Yeah, that's a big one. And if people want to call in about this one as well with access to HRT, that can get very nuanced, because I think the autonomy issue is a lot more like, we allow a lot more autonomy for adults because adults can make their own decisions. And there's definitely a difference between allowing somebody to get HRT and somebody getting ivermectin when ivermectin is not an appropriate treatment for something. And a lot of this comes down to the evidence behind these practices, right? We have mountains of evidence suggesting that gender dysphoria can be alleviated with affirmation and HRT. And so with adults, there's this informed consent model that's often utilized. So we communicate the risks and the benefits. And if you decide that you want to go forward with it, then you get to make that decision. With minors, it's a bit more tricky, but ultimately, minors aren't giving consent for themselves. It is their parents and the multitude of healthcare professionals weighing in on that. So people thinking that minors just get access to hormone therapy without like proper evaluation, like, no, minors have more, like, the most red tape in order to get access to that. And a lot of that comes down to mental health evaluations. Like, there's a lot of there are a lot of sign-offs they have to get from various healthcare professionals before they're even eligible to have that conversation. So I think how we regulate that depends on, you know, which specific treatment we're talking about, which field we're talking about, because I'm sure you'll agree the threshold for allowing social transition should be basically nothing. You should be allowed to change your hair, your makeup, your clothes, your name with very little barriers. But, you know, getting a minor on puberty blockers would be a bit harder to do. So.
Yeah. Well, can you give us any of the, you know, kind of guiding principles or what the expectations are for that sort of gatekeeping? I know we've got a couple of calls on the line. I know I'm excited to talk to Anne here in just a moment, but while we're here, can you give us any of the sort of broad strokes of how the ethics are maybe intended to work in that space?
Yeah. So we have mountains of evidence that suggests that poor outcomes are reduced when trans people are given proper affirmation and gender affirming care. And so one of the big concerns is especially high risk individuals. So people who are at risk of self-harm or of suicidal ideation. And so those people, especially, we want to address early, because if we can provide them a way to live more authentically, but also a way to prevent harm, that is something we need to do pretty urgently. And so a lot of times the minors that are getting access to this care in childhood are doing so because they're already high risk. The people who can wait often do. And kind of how we decide how early we can go depends on, number one, how like what time frame does this therapy need to be administered? Like, puberty blockers cannot be given unless you're going through puberty. There's really no point in doing that otherwise. And so that's a bit time sensitive. And then with hormone therapy, you're going to wait until somebody is of a developmentally appropriate age for that to be given. So it all comes down to developmental appropriateness. So like, there's a lot of like dishonest language being used to prevent people from getting gender affirming care, because they'll say the word child or they'll say the word minor, and your brain goes to think of toddler, when really, when we say like minors are getting hormone therapy, we're talking about 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and that's different than 4-year-old. Like the most gender affirming care a toddler is going to get is therapy and being able to explore their identity, which that's really not super controversial and shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. And it's worth pointing out 16-year-olds not on a lark, right? Like, there are a lot of steps in this process. It's not the type of thing that you do, you know, going down to Sally's Beauty Supply and deciding to dye your hair in an afternoon. There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else we want to kind of get in on this before we take these next few callers?
Let's not keep our callers waiting. We can come back to this stuff maybe if we have some time at the end.
All right. Well, Flabbergasted, it was great having you up here. We might bring you back up in a little bit.
I loved listening to you all talk about science stuff.
All right. Let's talk with Anne. Her pronouns are she, her, from California.
Mm-hmm.
Anne, you are live on Talk Heathen. It sounds like you want to talk about how to properly address they, them, trans people. Tell us a bit more about your question here.
Yeah, I'm just like, is there any other, you know how like a man, you know, you would say sir, or woman, ma'am, or anything. Is there any other term, or, you know, because I just want to call people what they want to be called.
Generally, it's what they tell you they want to be called. But if you are in a situation where you're meeting a stranger and you want to use that type of honorific, mix is generally what we would use for somebody who's non-binary, like Mr., Mrs., Mix, and that's generally spelled MX. How does that strike you, Ben?
Yeah, that's what I would say as well.
Okay. But to do that, would you need to first know their pronouns, or?
Well, their honorific might be different than their pronouns. And so a lot of times I've just switched to asking from the get-go. Like when I meet somebody, it's the same thing as asking for their name. So you ask for their name and then you can say, what pronouns do you use? Or if you're confused, if let's say you already knew somebody, you know their pronouns, and you don't know to call them Mr., Ms., Mix, etc., you can ask them like, hey, I know I've known you for a bit. In this type of setting, how would you like me to refer to you? And most people that use gender divergent pronouns or honorifics are happy that you asked the question and happy to share with you what they'd like to use. And I think making this more of a standard interaction and normalizing it is helping people. So even if you don't have kind of gender divergent pronouns or honorifics, if you go out and you say, oh yeah, I'm going to introduce myself with my name, my pronouns, and here's how to address me, that might let the other person know that you are you're open to that and you're open to accepting them for the way that they are. So that's what I would start doing.
Okay, I can understand that. I'm not trying to use this as an excuse. You know, I'm a little older, and this is, for me, this stuff is kind of like within the last 10 years or so. And I'm just trying to, you know, learn how to talk to people more, how to address people better, because I don't want to be, you know, insensitive or.
Yeah, and I hear that. I very much appreciate that. I think that learning some of these social niceties and some of the etiquette can be valuable. But I'll say, frankly, that if your goal is to not offend people, to show care and to show kindness, focus on that. You know, learning the etiquette can be valuable, and I'm not saying that some of this terminology won't be useful in your daily life, but if you are proceeding with kindness, with acceptance, with openness, and, you know, honestly, just treating a trans person like any other stranger, but doing so in a way that is broadly loving and kind, you're going to be doing exactly what you need to do. You know, again, I'm not saying not to worry about some of these words, but don't let it worry you too much, because if you proceed kindly rather than getting anxious or overwhelmed about the risk of potentially putting your foot in your mouth, you're going to have a much better experience for everybody.
Yes, that makes sense. I do tend to get very anxious and very nervous. I'm a naturally nervous person.
Sure. And so many of these concepts are new to the broader culture. And certainly anybody who is hoping or anticipating to be addressed with they them pronouns or with a mixed honorific or, whatever else might be appropriate for them is going to be aware of the fact that they exist in a culture where many of these concepts are still coming into the mainstream and still gaining broader acceptance. So you're not going to surprise or shock anybody by maybe being a bit hesitant or uncertain at first. And that's okay. I think we can all muddle through this so long as we're doing so in a loving and respectful way.
Yes, absolutely. That does make sense. That does make a lot of sense. And it's just a matter of being polite but not being overly stressed out, I guess.
Yeah. I find that so much of people's challenges with pronoun usage comes down to feeling anxious, either feeling anxious that they're going to get it wrong or really over eager to get it right, or, just kind of creating a sense of drama here or trying to make some sort of point. I don't know that it is broadly a problem for somebody to accidentally slip or use the wrong honorific in a brief moment, particularly as we're talking to strangers or getting to know somebody or getting to learn more about them. I think what causes so much friction in our society is when people go into it trying to make some sort of political point or trying over anxiously to make even, quote, the right political point in a way that maybe distracts from the actual interaction, from the personhood and the actual discussion at play here. Ben, is all of that fair to say?
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I think that there is a cultural shift in something very specific, and that is, I think, in the past, it's been just kind of standard that you make assumptions about other people, and oftentimes we get social consequences and negative social consequences if our assumption is wrong. And so I think that can drive a lot of that anxiety because we've been conditioned and taught to think, oh, I need to assume the correct thing about you. And if I assume wrong, or if I ask, or if it seems like I don't know what to assume, then we get punished for it in our society. And so that goes with things like if you assume somebody is gay but they're not, you might be yelled at, or if you get somebody's gender wrong, you'd be yelled at. And so I think we get this idea that we have to assume correctly, and that might make us more anxious. But now we have this cultural shift to say, well, no, actually, it's okay to ask, and we want you to ask. And so taking that perspective shift from instead thinking that because I asked, that means I don't know enough, or that means that I'm stupid. Well, no, asking just means that you're aware that you're not reading somebody's mind, and you're trying to understand somebody better and trying to grow the relationship. So I think thinking about asking as a positive thing instead of thinking of it as a negative thing might be helpful and might take away some of that anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's very helpful, and I'm really glad to have some insight. I don't know why this has kind of been, bothering me for a while. Not bothering me, but just something I've been thinking about for a while.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of just wanting to be polite to people and wanting to be respectful, and we could use a lot more of that.
Fair to say. Yeah. No, I appreciate your interest here, and I very much want to thank you for giving us a call today.
All right. Thank you for having me on the show, guys. You have a great day.
Absolutely. You as well.
Thank you, Anne. Bye. All right. What a wholesome call.
Yeah. It's nice to know, even in this modern world, there are people who are genuinely interested in not being a dick.
All right. Before we get into the next one, I do want to give some more announcements. So don't go anywhere, Bill. We will be getting to your call very shortly. But first, I wanted to address that we have a way for you to share out the show with people that you know or people you don't know. Of course, you can share out the links to the show every week, but if you want to get a flyer, you can go to tiny.cc/ACA flyers to print out basically an advertisement for people to call into the show. Make sure that you're doing so legally, so make sure you have permission to put these where you're going to put them. But some examples of places might be a community bulletin board. Some local establishments might have a place where they house a lot of these things. If you're at a university, you might be able to get permission to put these up there. So definitely post these around and take a picture of it when you do. Send it to tv@atheist-community.org, and we might feature your picture on an upcoming show. Also, you can send super chats, and we will read super chats at the end of the show. So get those in. We also have merch. If you go to tiny.cc/merchaca, you can get t-shirts, hoodies. I still need to get a crop top. Every time I read this, I'm reminded that I promised I would get a crop top and wear it, but that might be coming soon. Hats, tumblers, mugs, all that jazz. So don't forget that. And like I said, like the video, subscribe to the channel, enable those notifications, and comment below. And I think that's the announcements for now. Are you ready to get into the next
Yeah,
call?
absolutely. Let's talk to Bill in California, if we may.
All right, let's do it. Bill, pronouns are he, him from California. You are live on Talk Heathen. Sounds like you want to ask us why we don't challenge expert callers' credentials. Tell us a bit more about what inspired you to call in today.
Well, I've been wanting to ask this question for a bit but I wanted to wait until it was kind of topic specific, and then you guys started talking about consensus and expertise and things like that. So I thought, I'll give it a try. And by the way, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Ben and Christy and everybody that's there for the great job you guys do. It's
well, thank you.
Entertaining, very educational. Yeah. So let me just say, there was a few, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 months ago, you had Dr. Blitz, who was a physicist. He was a co-host, and there was some gentleman that called in that was talking about this, that, and whatnot about physics, and insisting that he had done all this research and things like that. And then Dr. Blitz came up with one question. He said, "Would you mind telling me what a tensor is?" And it completely exposed this person as someone who didn't know what he was talking about. And I thought it was so refreshing, if you pardon. And by the way, I'm a little nervous. I'm always nervous when I call into these shows. So if it sounds like I'm actually out doing my morning jog, I'm not. I'm just a little nervous. But
totally fair. Yeah.
Like if somebody calls in and says something like, I've done a lot of research on evolution. I would be tempted to say something like, "So you know a lot about evolution. Would you mind elucidating the paint pot problem first, and so that we can assess, how deep you've done your reading and things like that." And I understand that this is not an easy thing to do. Not everybody's an expert on everything, and you might not know 1 or 2 questions that could, that could verify that somebody knows what they're talking about. But I'm just wondering, and maybe you guys want to be very polite, and you are. You guys are always so polite to a fault, and bending over backwards.
Fair to say.
Hear what these people are saying and give them and steel man their arguments and be very, very differential. And I appreciate that. But I'm just wondering why it is. It seems to me like you don't push back.
Like we could be a little more aggressive.
When somebody claims,
That's probably fair to say, If somebody calls in and they say that they have some very specific credential, usually there's no real way to verify that. But as we get to talking to somebody and it becomes clear that they are not the, subject matter expert that they maybe claim to be, I kind of like to just let that air itself out for the audience to see for themselves, so that it's not as antagonistic, and so that people can then kind of decide for themselves, how seriously do we want to take any of these philosophies? Ben, what is your sort of, I guess, strategy for handling some of the very big, grandiose claims that we maybe hear from our callers on occasion?
Yeah, so I tend to be more aggressive with this. I don't know if, Bill, if you've seen some of the shows where I do call people out on that. I think I have very different approaches depending on what the caller claims to be. If they claim to work in healthcare, that's one that I've heard before, is they'll use a very vague statement of "I work in healthcare" to say that, and then make a claim about medical misinformation. And like, okay, well, working in healthcare could mean a variety of different things. Like, can you tell me specifically what your work is in? And I occasionally I will use that technique of asking them to explain something a bit more complex. But in those cases, like I try to make it very clear that if you are asserting expertise, I'm going to hold you to the level of an expert. I'm going to expect that you can hold your own at that level. And I'm going to be more critical of the things that you say. Whereas if somebody comes on the show and they say that they're not an expert, or they don't claim to be an expert, but they have a very strong opinion about something, my threshold for how much responsibility they have to take for said claim like goes down. It's like, okay, maybe you were misinformed about something, and I take more of a straight epistemology approach to it and address how they got to that particular claim. But I think my level of aggression will definitely change depending on what the caller claims to understand.
Well, yeah, in your case, the stakes are so high because it's medicine. So yeah, I would hope that you would do that. Yeah, so I get it. So, well, I mean, and I apologize. I don't have much of a follow up. I just wanted to kind of get that out there and get your take on it. And you know, again, I appreciate what you guys do. I think it's fantastic, and it's thoroughly entertaining every Sunday. I try to tune into you guys, and you know, please keep fighting the good fight, if you will.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. You have a great Sunday.
Talk to you soon.
You guys as well.
All right, bye. All right. Before we get to lost in the sauce of discussion, I do want to shout out the patrons. Like we mentioned, you can join the Patreon, but you can possibly get your name on the list of the top 5 patrons of the week. Christy, would you like to read those, or would you like me to read them?
Yeah, real quickly, in the number 1 spot, we've got Oops All Singularity. Number 2, holding heavy, is Dingleberry Jackson. 3, Kalevi Helveti. 4, Period. Just the period character. That's who's in the number 4 spot, period. And number 5 is Casey Kickendall. Our honorable mention this week, Diana Marie Leonard. Thank you to everybody who joins us out on Patreon.
Awesome. Do we want to bring Flabbergasted back up for a little bit to continue our discussion?
Yeah, we can continue the discussion a little bit before we wrap up the show.
Yeah, sounds good. As I do know, we had some interesting questions kind of at the later on in the questions you put in the notes. So I did want to get kind of your thoughts about a very prevalent topic right now, and that is gender dysphoria a mental illness? And how do we decide what is and what isn't a mental illness? And are people using these terms appropriately?
Yeah. So the DSM and other books have definitely been adding some nuance and trying to capture some of the elements of the trans experience in a way that I can only describe as developing, which is to say perhaps better than it was, but not as good as it needs to be. But when we talk about like gender dysphoria specifically, I think of gender dysphoria being a mental illness the same way I think of anxiety being a mental illness, which is to say, you need anxiety. You were born with a body that requires the ability to have nervousness. Some amount of worry is what makes sure that you go to work on time and remember your wife's birthday and don't run people over with your car. Like, some amount of anxiety is necessary to be a healthy, happy, functioning person. And gender dysphoria is just a perhaps form of social anxiety, or it definitely can present that way, like a concern over your relationship with your body, a concern over other people's relationship with your body, how you're being perceived and seen and understood. And I do think that some amount of that nervousness or distress is probably a good and healthy and functional thing. If, however, you are somebody who is so anxious that you never get a good night's rest and you are just constantly worried about everything and hypervigilant and paralyzed and unable to focus, then we might diagnose you with a anxiety disorder. And there are different forms of disordered anxiety, and there are different treatments, and there's all this sort of nuance that we might look into. But it's because that naturally occurring healthy aspect of your identity has risen to a level of significance where it's causing enough distress or enough problem in your life that we start to see like meaningful symptomology. And I think that's maybe how we should understand gender dysphoria as well. Like, just being trans, it doesn't inherently mean that you are constantly miserable and that you have a terrible relationship with your gender. However, being trans in America in 2026 is going to come with a certain amount of distress. Is there a mental illness at play here? Well, only when that distress gets to a certain level of symptomology that it really requires some amount of like treatment and care. How does that model strike you, particularly as a medical doctor, Ben?
Yeah, there's a lot of this comparison with people trying to say that gender dysphoria is the same thing as body dysmorphia. And at least in the research that I've read, this is untrue, especially because the ways that you manage both conditions are opposite. And I think you had a good question in the notes about delusion. A lot of people say that gender dysphoria is a delusion, but what we see with kind of those definitions, being trans or having gender dysphoria is not an issue with you incorrectly perceiving your body. Like, that's not the issue, right? Like, trans people are very, very aware of what our body looks like and does. And that reality does cause us some distress oftentimes because it disconnects with our sense of self. And so it's not a disorder of your sense of self. That would be ridiculous. There's an incongruence between the presentation of your body and the way society responds to the way your body looks. And that contradicts your sense of self. So that's different from body dysmorphia, where there is a difference in how you perceive your body and an inaccuracy a lot of times in how you perceive your body, to where even if you address those things that make you uncomfortable in your body, the dysmorphia still persists. And so that's why these are completely opposite things. And so that's why we don't recommend surgeries for people with body dysmorphia, because the issue isn't with their body in that case, it's with the perception.
Mm-hmm.
But gender dysphoria isn't an issue with the perception. It is a mismatch between your sense of self and your body. Does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, and I think just not to overstate it or repeat it overly much, but I just kind of want to highlight that being trans is not in and of itself a mental illness. And if you are trans in 2026 America, you are likely to struggle with a diagnosable mental condition. In the same way that if you are poor in 2026 America, you likely are struggling with aspects of anxiety and depression simply because of the circumstances. It's not required, but it's going to be strongly, strongly correlated. And I say all of this because for so long, when we talked about gay people specifically, there was this notion of, well, gay people have such a high suicide rate. You know, they're so miserable. There's so much anxiety and depression within that community. Being gay must mean that you're mentally ill. Well, no, being gay in a homophobic culture has a high correlation with mental illness. And when trans folks are being murdered and treated the way that they are in our society right now, there's going to be a not automaticness to some of those symptoms, but a really strong correlation and connection to them.
Would it be fair to say that it's not like being trans isn't obviously a mental illness, but it's about how people treat trans people that can cause a trans person to develop a mental illness effectively? Like that's kind of what we're talking. Is that a fair way of phrasing it? Okay. Can I also, I want to ask a question that someone, I was talking to some people about trans identities and as a cis guy, of course, that's what I spend my time doing. And some relatively bad faith askers, but I had a question asked and I really am curious what the two of you think about it as a doctor, trans doctor and a psychologist who focuses on these things. Someone asked me if gender is a social construct, and if we see gender dysphoria happening within, trans people and non-binary people as a thing, if someone was born on an island, completely isolated from anyone else at any point in time, would that person or could that person ever actually experience gender dysphoria? And I had an answer to it, but I'm really curious about what you two think.
This is a very nuanced question, and I love it. It addresses the complexity of gender identity versus gender in society. And I make a clear distinction kind of between like this trinity, if you will, of gender. So you have your sex, which is strictly related to like your biology. You have gender identity, which is your sense of self, kind of related to psychology. And then you have gender, which is sociology and more related to how you engage with the society around you. And there's actually there's a kind of perspective called gender abolitionism, which kind of plays into a lot of this. Is there potential for gender to just not exist as a concept within society? And I think I don't have like a super solid opinion because I just don't know enough about sociology and psychology to really give a super informed hypothesis. But it's an interesting interplay of how much of gender is related to just your sense of self. And if somebody were raised in an environment where none of that was enforced, if you weren't taught about gender, if you weren't in a society that treated gender differently, would you still have a gender identity? Or is that something more related to sociology? And that's something I can happily say I don't know, but I'm excited to discuss it. Christy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually asked this question or a formulation of it to a number of the hosts at the ACA. And where I kind of come down on it is when we talk about this mythical person on this deserted island, we are kind of really breaking some of the rules of what it means to be a person, let alone what it means to have a gender. You know, if you look at like case studies of quote unquote feral children who have been raised by wolves and these types of stories that we have anecdotally throughout history, what you see, of course, is a lot of mental illness and a lot of struggle with like coping with society. I would go so far as to theorize, and this is all stuff that happens in a thought experiment that we can't necessarily like identify and isolate and test.
Nor should we.
Nor should we. But I would imagine, being born, even if you are, incubated and provided with all of the necessary resources and nutritions and all of your objective needs, if you spent your entire life on a deserted island without interacting with other people, you're not going to have language. you're not going to have mental health as we conceive of it. So I don't know that you're going to have a gender, but I'm also not convinced that you're going to have a lot of the other aspects of humanity that we sort of take for granted as being a person. I know that getting into consciousness can take this conversation completely off the rails, but so many of us think in words and in language. And even those of us who don't do have that linguistic component to our cognition. If you take that off the table, what would it even mean to have thoughts of gender dysphoria? What would it mean to have a thought? If a thought is a feeling, like, it is very, very difficult to start drawing these lines, which I really just mean to say that even if we created some hypothetical community where you could be raised without all of these bullshit gender expectations, I still think that we're going to see some amount of gendered expectation evolve into our culture. I think that if we were to start from scratch and SimCity all of this, we could definitely have a much more egalitarian view of gender. We could have one that is much less binary, that is much less constrictive. I do think that there is a maybe more utopian ideal of what gender could mean to a society. But if you were to send an ark to some far off planet and let them invent their own culture, I do think that gender is eventually going to come to show up in that culture. That's just me theorizing as a clinician, but I don't know. That's kind of where I come down on some of these ideas.
Yeah, it seems to me that this whole question is trying to identify, like if gender is a social construct, then what does it look like without society? I feel like it doesn't exist. I think I agree with you wholly on that. Like, if you take away society, you take away gender, and then you're left only with biological traits. So you eliminate the even concept of gender dysphoria. I think it's exactly what you were kind of saying.
You're also eliminating, like, the looking glass self, concepts of who you are as a person, concepts of identity, let alone gender identity, concepts of I. If you don't know the word I, do you think, do you am? Like, how does any of that really work? We're getting, really into some interesting theoretical spaces, but it's so divorced from our ability to really understand or appreciate this person that we wouldn't even be able to communicate with them to ask them about their gender identity.
But I do think what the thought experiment does kind of highlight is that when we talk about gender dysphoria isn't a problem with the person. Gender dysphoria is a problem with the way people are treating that person and how they're reacting to it.
Goodness of fit within your community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah,
that was
definitely some very, very interesting discussions. And now that we've kind of like addressed our thoughts on that one, there are plenty of things in our society that kind of get mistaken for disordered behavior or like sexual deviance. So, Christy, what other things are treated kind of in a similar way as gender dysphoria?
Yeah, I mean, it again, there are these issues of goodness of fit, and we don't examine them. We are taught so little about sexuality in a explicit way. Like, as a culture, as a society, most of us get very little, if any, academic training on what sexuality is or could be. And we have all of this implicit messaging on the cover of magazines and in music videos and in cooking demonstrations and telling us what sex maybe ought to look like, such that people tend to have a really strong disgust mechanism for any type of sexuality that they themselves haven't experienced or been exposed to in any sort of meaningful way. And they mistake that disgust for morality. So really, any form of sexuality that is sufficiently uncommon is often deemed unhealthy. And those two things are very distinct and shouldn't be considered identical. Basically, the old joke goes, anybody who has more sex than their therapist can be labeled a sex addict, which is just to say that we need to work on being more accepting and understanding of people's differences and of our own differences, and not rush to pathologize these things unless we're seeing, as we talked about at the top, distress. Your sex habits, no matter what they are, no matter how much time or energy or money you're spending on toys or videos or whatever else, if it's not causing harm in your life or in the life of somebody else, go for it. If it is causing harm because you're spending money that you don't have, you're spending time and energy that you don't have because you're operating outside of your own value system, then let's maybe look at it. But we so rarely use that distress principle when discussing these things, at least on a social level.
That's very interesting because in the way you described it, it sounds like you could have very different criteria for diagnosing this sex addiction just based on who your therapist is. If you had, let's say, a therapist with a very low libido and just not a lot of desire for sexual activity or no desire for sexual activity, then maybe anybody could be labeled as a sex addict, because if your therapist isn't having any sex, then if you're having more than them, then it sounds like anybody could be given that label.
Right, which is why sex addiction is not something that appears in the DSM-5. It's not something that appears in the vast majority of psychological literature. I don't want to dismiss the fact that it is in the ICD-10 and that there are related diagnoses. I definitely don't want to make it sound like there is one specific consensus on this issue. But I will say that when you scratch the surface on who are in these two pretty distinct camps, you start to see where the money is coming from and what the motivation really looks like. Organizations like ASECT, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, says very firmly that sex addiction is not a useful construct. It's not a valuable way of understanding people who do perhaps have out of control sexual behaviors, or perhaps sexual behaviors that are causing harm to their lives. On the other hand, if you look at all forms of 12-step programs or inpatient treatment facilities for different forms of addiction, all of a sudden you see, oh yeah, sex addiction, porn addiction, phone addiction, screen addiction, all of these things are definitely real, and we'll bill your insurance for them and you won't have to pay a dime. Like, there is a lot of money, a lot of misinformation, and frankly, a lot of bad actors that start to show up whenever we look at uncommon or quote unquote deviant sexual behaviors.
That sounds a lot to me like the sex addiction sounds a lot to me when people say sugar addiction. Like, you're not getting addicted to sugar. Like, you can have problematic intake. You can intake too much for what your body can use, and there can be consequences for that. But if your body runs on carbohydrates and runs on sugars, that is a necessary thing for your life. And so it's kind of
hyperventilating is not the same thing as being addicted to air.
Right. So do you think that the way we use the language surrounding these things impacts how people are treated or how people are given assistance when they need it?
So much so. I mean, the reality of myself as a therapist is that when I am, pushing the little check boxes to let people know what type of therapist I am on all of these different referral websites, there isn't a box that says struggling with out of control sexual behaviors. There's one that says sex addiction. And so people come to me looking for treatment for sex addiction. And especially when I'm just meeting somebody, it doesn't fall to me to take that label away from them. If somebody describes themselves as a sex addict, I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, actually, there are much more useful constructs for your right. It's not necessarily my right to tell people that they are or aren't these things or how words work. And I think we are doing an incredible disservice to people who are struggling with their sexuality and to people who are struggling with withdrawal from alcohol, from heroin, from these other substances that have a more classical addiction concept attached to them. When we talk about gambling addiction or phone addiction or sex addiction, we're talking about something called a process addiction. And frankly, that term process addiction is really problematic, and I think prevents a lot of people from getting adequate care. And I can appreciate where it comes from and why it's here, but I definitely think that's getting in the way.
Just like everything, when we hypersimplify things, it tends to make things problematic in a different way, it seems.
Yeah, fair to say. And, I think it was born out of this notion that came in the 90s where we wanted to stop being assholes to drug users, where we wanted to start to begin to recognize that somebody who is struggling from like opioid withdrawal is somebody who has an illness and who needs to be cared and treated using a medical model rather than, a judgmental one.
Yeah,
and
one
we
where we treat
wanted
them like they're inherently a bad person.
Yeah, yeah. And there was some desire maybe to see people who were struggling with gambling or people who were struggling with, spending time and energy and money on their sex life that they didn't have available. We wanted to maybe extend those people the same amount of grace, of understanding, of no longer finger wagging and judging. And I certainly appreciate that. But when we start getting these things all lumped together and we lose sight of the chemical withdrawal component, then we're really misunderstanding what addiction is or what words mean, frankly.
Yeah, and I'm curious, just thinking back to my religious upbringing, and knowing that there's a very distinct way that different genders were treated in terms of sexuality. So I know if a man was like had a higher libido and engaged in more sexual activity, that was like they had a higher threshold that they were allowed to do, whereas women were basically, if you had any kind of sexual expression at all, it was like, no, that's too much for you. Have you had any experience kind of addressing that with people?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many misconceptions about what a healthy sexuality ought to look like or should look like. So again, I really point people to the that distress principle. But I'll say anytime somebody starts using the word libido, you can almost immediately take them out of a scientific context. I'm not saying it isn't a useful word. I'm not saying we can't discuss like, oh, my partner has a way different libido than mine, or we have, desire mismatch non-concordance. Like, there are ways to talk about these things. But when we try to scientifically measure libido, we start to realize that it's a really messy, not particularly valid or reliably useful construct, that people want different types of things to different degrees and in different levels and in different ways. And that's why we're never going to find a libido medication. We're never going to be able to give somebody a pill that, quote, fixes their libido. We might help them to deal with their anxiety. We might be able to treat their sexual response. We might be able to help with their energy levels or any other number of things that could be connected to their desire for sex. But there's never going to be a libido drug because our bodies don't really have a libido button. They have a bunch of other levels and levers and switches and pulleys and all of these other complicated aspects.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It's like walking up to a soundboard and being like, well, which one of these switches gets you there? And it's like, well, all of them, depending on the person and the ratio and the,
Yeah, I mean, this isn't what we were talking about, but just as a quick freebie, the same kind of goes for the concept of an orgasm. And I don't think people realize that. They think that you can very discreetly measure the number of orgasms that anybody has had, or that we can look at any number of, EKGs or MRIs or these different things and be like, oh yeah, here's the orgasm center of the brain. And when it gets at least this bright, then orgasm has occurred. Orgasms don't work like that. If you're ever wondering, was that an orgasm? I think I'll point you to Emily Nagoski's writing on the subject, which is basically, do you think it was an orgasm? Yes? Then that was an orgasm. Because what we traditionally think of as an orgasm is actually perhaps dozens of different bodily processes that often happen in conjunction with one another, but nobody, if anybody, gets every single one of those processes to happen and occur at the exact same time or in the exact same way. Our bodies are just so much more multifactorial and nuanced than all of that. And I think it's really important that we reframe away from this idea of, well, did a man have an ejaculation? Then there was an orgasm. And I guess also women have kind of that thing where their breath gets really flushed or whatever, but who cares? Like, that's sort of the way our society deals with orgasm, and it's pretty far from the mark.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say like trying to treat it like this. It's this more generalizable, objective thing instead of saying like this is your experience of this. And at least like from the medical side, like you mentioned, there are reasons why people may have like a lower desire to participate in sex.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be, it's like, yeah, we can pinpoint a few different things. Like, do you have a thyroid issue? Do you have anemia? Do you have some other contributing factor? And for that, the sex drive is less so of a, we have to get you to a set threshold, but more of like, are you happy with where you're at? Like, were you at a certain place? Like, did you have certain feelings or experiences before that you were able to rely upon? But now that's gone. Like, how do we improve your quality of life for you? So maybe shifting it to more of an individualized thing instead of this is what you have to do to orgasm.
Yeah, not just individualized, but I'll also say, and I know we're pretty far afield from the discussion we maybe started to have, and I know we're getting close to the end of the show, but this is such important information that I want to make sure to hit on it, which is just to suggest that for people who maybe are struggling with their quote unquote libido or are wanting to be wanting, or maybe they're wanting sex, but they also don't like desire sex and they're trying to sort that out. I want to point out that so often it's not that we don't sufficiently desire sex or that our libido, our want isn't there. It's not that we don't have the gas. We don't need to go out and buy sexy lingerie or expensive toys or pornography or any of these things to pump up our desire levels. It's not about the gas, it's about the brakes. It's what are the things that are getting in the way of our sexuality? It's what are the things that are making us nervous? What are the things that are distracting us? What are the things that are bothering us and are on our mind? You know, to mention Emily Nagoski again, she points out that people don't stop having sex because they don't have enough fancy lingerie. It's because they forgot to put a clean towel next to the bed or some mouthwash next to the bed. So if we're trying to raise our libido, so to speak, we can really focus on getting some of the roadblocks out of the way, taking our foot off of the brake rather than worrying about slamming our foot down on the gas.
That's a really good way of thinking about it. And I think I haven't heard it described that way before. So I really appreciate that.
I definitely feel like I need to put some clean towels and some mouthwash by the side of my
right.
bed.
Yeah. You know, whatever those barriers are for you, maybe it's because you didn't schedule things for the next day. Maybe it's about, you know, whatever worries and distractions get in the way of life.
Yeah.
But it does sound like overall, though, like even in this conversation about orgasms and sex interest, it's almost like everything that has to do with being a human is really complicated, really nuanced, and there are no single like A, B options for pretty much anything.
Yeah, we create these categories to try and understand things, but they're broadly speaking descriptive. You know, they're not prescriptive. They're not telling us what we ought to do so much as what we tend to do.
We're trying to take our extremely limited understanding of these topics and put them into boxes so we can communicate them better with other people. And then the result of that is people start thinking that that is what we are and then start prescribing, well, therefore you must be either a man or a woman.
Fair to say.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's a great place to wrap up that discussion, I think. Thank you both so much for being here today. Flabbergasted, I know you were backstage for a bit of the show. Was there anything related to the callers that you kind of wanted to weigh in on?
I feel like nothing that we didn't really kind of already hit in some of the things we talked about outside of those calls. So, yeah. I think we had some great conversations, and I think the one thing that really stood out to me as a point that kind of came up in some of those calls and in our other conversation was just talking about where we get our information and how to know if it's any good.
Mm-hmm.
Learn how to do that.
Definitely.
Stop assuming that just because some guy has 50,000 followers on TikTok that makes them reputable.
Fair to say.
Yeah. Christy, do you have any kind of final words for the audience?
No, I my mind keeps coming back to that conversation with Anne, and I don't want to, just repeat all the same talking points, but I do want to emphasize that I think so often we worry about the etiquette around some of these like culture rory type issues. And sometimes that focus on etiquette is useful, but oftentimes it just makes us anxious and it gets in the way of being sincere and kind and generous people. And if you provide with that sort of mindful lens and framework, you don't need to know all of the right words in order to show up exactly the way that you need to and exactly the way that you would hopefully want to.
Definitely. And with that, let's send out some love rings to all the people in the audience. If you don't believe, this is your community. We appreciate you all being here, hanging out with us, having a chat. And if you do believe, we don't hate you.
We're just not convinced.
We want the truth. So watch Truth Wanted Live, Fridays at 7 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTTW and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect online at tiny.cc/call-TW.